Reverend Tom Emanuel, who was born and raised on sacred Lakota land in the Black Hills of South Dakota. He received his training as a social scientist at the University of South Dakota in 2008, and his training as a theologian at the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California in 2018. He is an ordained Congregationalist minister and a PhD researcher at the University of Glasgow, where he explores the spiritual significance of the Lord of the Rings to fan communities in a post-Christian religious landscape. He lives in Glasgow with his spouse and their two Tolkien-loving children. Okay, so Tom has very kindly recorded his paper, and do we have it ready to go? Super. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to virtually recorded Tom, and then he's going to join us for a Q&A afterwards.
Hello, I'm the Reverend Tom Emanuel. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm delighted that you've joined me for my talk today. Beside the waters of Anduin, we lay down and wept. Exilic theology in the Akallabêth. An exemplary nation is elected by God to fulfill a unique calling. Summoned to a promised land of material and spiritual abundance and tutored in the ways of wisdom, God's chosen people grow in power and splendor. Soon, however, cracks begin to form. The leaders fall away from their covenant to love God and love their neighbors. And the radical vision upon which the community was founded erodes, to be replaced with the oppression of the poor and elite entanglement in webs of imperial power. At the apex of its hubris, the nation is laid low by a cataclysm so total that it shatters the people's understanding of themselves, their world, and their God. A handful of survivors are subsequently forced into exile, and looking back from a distant land, the faithful attempt to come to terms with the enormity of the catastrophe. The question looms like a storm cloud on the western horizon. How could God allow this to happen? Now, adherents of the Abrahamic faiths will recognize this as the story of Israel in the period leading up to and immediately following the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonian Empire in 586 BCE. Fans of J.R.R. Tolkien's literary mythology may notice that it is also the Downfall of Númenor. In this paper, I wish to tease out the parallels between these two narratives of fidelity, apostasy, and catastrophe. I will read the prophet Jeremiah in conversation with Tolkien's Akallabêth, and the figure to whom its authorship is attributed within Tolkien's secondary world, Elendil the Faithful, leader of the Númenorians in exile. Jeremiah and the Akallabêth both address the problem of theodicy, that is, the question of how an all-powerful, all-loving God can permit suffering and evil. Their twined approaches to this conundrum shed light on the theological dynamics at work, not just in Tolkien's secondary world, but in our primary world as well. In fact, I close by suggesting that Tolkien's legendarium as a whole can be read as theodicy, a mythopoetic reckoning with the irrevocable loss of a communal past and the challenge of living into a hopeful future in the midst of a broken world. Now, to note the parallels between the myth of Númenor and Plato's myth of Atlantis is to run the risk of restating the obvious. Tolkien repeatedly and explicitly links Númenor with his, quote, Atlantis haunting, his dream of the Great Wave, and Verlyn Flieger has shown that he also draws in Celtic legends of drowned western lands, such as Lyoness off the coast of Cornwall, or Hey Brazil off the coast of Ireland. Elsewhere, Tolkien links Númenor with the biblical flood, calling Elendil a Noachian figure, and Pamina Fernández Camacho has explored the island kingdom's wider Near Eastern valences, including Adûnaic's debt to Semitic languages, and Númenor's maritime empire, which can be compared with the ancient Phoenicians and Carthaginians. She likewise draws parallels between the Akallabêth and the biblical Exodus, as do Karen Cooper and Kevin Wedder. They note the similarity between Ar-Pharazôn, the last king of Númenor, and the oppressive Pharaoh of Egypt, right down to their names, as well as the way in which the Akallabêth functions as the founding narrative of the Dunedain of Middle-earth, in much the same way that Exodus does for Israel. However, whereas the Exodus narrates God's liberating activity in the history of the Hebrew people, the Downfall of Númenor tells instead the story of a divinely wrought catastrophe. Now, when Megan Fontenot reads Númenor through the lens of apocalypse, she's striking nearer to the biblical mark. But for all their portrayal of cosmic devastation, Jewish and Christian apocalypses remain fundamentally eucatastrophic. The apocalyptic unveiling is a harsh but necessary prelude to the hopeful revelation of the reign of God. The fall of Númenor, meanwhile, is an all but unmitigated disaster. So if we're seeking for a biblical prototype for the Akallabêth, the exilic prophet Jeremiah is a better fit. Jeremiah's prophetic career begins during the reign of King Josiah of Judah in 626 BCE, and spans the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians in 586 and the subsequent exile of a significant portion of the Judean population. Now, according to the royal theology of Judah's ruling elites, because God had chosen the Davidic dynasty, neither it nor its capital Jerusalem could ever be destroyed. The visible sign of this guarantee was the temple, God's own home. By way of contrast, Jeremiah proclaims that the people must constantly renew their covenant commitments to love God and love their neighbors as themselves, if they wish to remain in the promised land. The Judeans of his time have fallen away from their holy vocation to do justice and seek peace, but Jeremiah promises on God's behalf, quote, "If you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly one with another, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after other gods to your own hurt, then I will dwell with you in this place, in the land that I gave to your ancestors, forever and ever." Jeremiah chapter 7, verses 5 through 7. Now, by the early decades of the 6th century BCE, Judah has, on the other hand, entered into strategic alliances with regional imperial powers in a doomed campaign to stave off the might of Babylon, funneling resources into military armament rather than care for the vulnerable. Babylon's response to this is predictable. Invade Judah, raze Jerusalem to the ground, and send its inhabitants into exile. Jeremiah's own career concludes in Egypt, where he prophesies the eventual restoration of the fortunes of Judah and a return to the Holy Land. Now, the book of Jeremiah, as a text, is presented as a collection of the sayings of the prophet compiled by his scribe Baruch, but the actual history of its composition is more complicated. It appears to have been assembled in pieces over the course of the mid-6th century BCE, reaching its final form during or immediately following the Babylonian exile. The Old Testament scholar Kathleen O'Connor writes, quote, "What the book of Jeremiah does is to present a portrait of the prophet that mixes fact and interpretation inextricably. Its purpose was to help the people make sense of their tragedy, recover their identity, and move toward the future." End quote. Now, I'm going to argue that the Akallabêth fulfills a similar function for the Númenorian exiles, but first I must sketch out the complicated genesis of the narrative. It is, after all, Tolkien. Now, the composition of the Númenor myth falls out into three major periods. The Fall of Númenor, which was written in conjunction with The Lost Road in and around 1936. The Drowning of Anduin, which emerged alongside the Notion Club papers in 1944. And finally, the Akallabêth, which was completed in the late 1950s, and which Christopher Tolkien published mostly, but not entirely intact, in the Silmarillion in 1977. Now, according to Christopher Tolkien, his father saw these three different versions of the legend as three different textual traditions in Middle-earth. The Elvish Fall of Númenor, the Mannish Drowning of Anduin, and the mixed Dunedainic Akallabêth. What he's referring to here is the elaborate metatextual conceit that every story of Middle-earth is actually, scare quotes, written by a particular character in Middle-earth. Every text embodies a particular, limited viewpoint, informed by the fictional narrator's cultural and historical situation. So regarding the Akallabêth specifically, the line of Elros, also written in the late 1930s and published in Unfinished Tales in 1980, attributes it to Elendil, and notes that copies of the text were preserved in Gondor. And I just dropped my mouse, so give me 1 second. All right, we're back on board. So, Elendil is presented as the author of the Akallabêth, and there are good textual reasons for accepting that in this sense. One is the narrative prominence and detail of the conversations between Elendil and his father Emandil. Now, such private information could only have been gleaned from Elendil himself after the loss of his father and his departure to the west. And likewise, the crucial moment of the downfall itself is narrated from Elendil's perspective, in the ship off the eastern coast of Númenor. However, the final paragraphs of the published Akallabêth are clearly the additions of a later commentator. They refer to the changed shape of the world and latter-day legends of figures such as Elfwine of England, who would have stumbled upon the straight road to Elvenhome. And as a matter of fact, the frame narrative, which Christopher Tolkien excised from the published text in the Silmarillion, the Akallabêth is presented as direct address to Elfwine, from an unnamed narrator in Tol Eressëa, but presumably the Elvish historian Pengaloth. Now, if we accept Tolkien's metafictional frame, Pengaloth must have had access to a copy of the Akallabêth, which was brought over the Sundering Seas by one of the returning Elvish exiles, perhaps even Elrond himself. He did have something of a family interest in the story. I proceed upon the assumption that while the final text of the Akallabêth, as it was told to Elfwine, must have passed through the editorial hands of both scribes of Gondor, as well as the Eldar of the Lonely Isle, its core originates with Elendil himself. Now, this sets us up to discern the theological work that the Akallabêth is doing for the exiled Númenorians. For the Hebrew prophets, God is in control of history. Everything that occurs is ultimately of God's will. So for Jeremiah, the destruction of Jerusalem is no mere senseless tragedy. It is instead God using the Babylonian Empire to punish unfaithful Judah. The demolition of the Jerusalem temple, which was previously believed to be God's dwelling place on earth, thus produces a radical transformation in Israelite theology. And the prophets herald the shift from henotheism, which is the belief in multiple gods but primary commitment or devotion to a single deity, to monotheism, that is, the belief in a single transcendent deity to the total exclusion of all others. Monotheism, however, produces a conundrum, which will be familiar to both modern believers and non-believers. Namely, if God is indeed the omnipotent Lord of history, then why does God fail to prevent suffering? This is the problem of theodicy. Now, Jeremiah provides one answer to that question. Suffering is deserved punishment for wrongdoing. This theodicy of so-called blessings and curses is not the only biblical response to the problem of pain. You can see the Book of Job for an alternative. However, it remains a powerful strain in the theological heritage of the Abrahamic faiths. The Christian process theologian Catherine Keller views it as an understandable but nevertheless misguided attempt to maintain God's omnipotence at the expense of God's mercy. Divine love, in this reading, must be sacrificed upon the altar of divine control. Now, the Akallabêth, on my reading, articulates a fundamentally similar theodicy in response to a fundamentally similar catastrophe, a fact which Elendil's fictive authorship brings into focus. The capsule history of Númenor, which comprises the first section of the published text, provides a theological genealogy of Ilúvatar's role in Númenorian history. The Dúnedain received the land of Númenor as a reward for their role in the war against Morgoth. But the price of this gift is continued faithfulness to Ilúvatar and to the Valar as his plenipotentiaries. For Elendil and the latter-day Númenorians, though, the existence of Ilúvatar is a matter of belief, whereas mortality, the so-called gift of Ilúvatar, well, that's an unescapable reality. And this is a fact which Sauron exploits, this felt distance between the invisibility of God and the visibility of death, in building his support for the idolatrous cult of Melkor. Elendil and his followers remain unconvinced, and with prophetic insight they foresee that the time is coming, and is surely now at hand, when Númenor's pursuit of deathlessness will turn to its undoing. But unlike readers, who can take Tolkien's own pronouncements about the metaphysics of Middle-earth at face value, the faithful have no guarantees. Ilúvatar's existence and the true nature of mortality must be taken on, well, faith. And so it is that when the disaster comes to pass, when Númenor actually falls down into the ocean and the shape of the world is changed, Elendil and his followers do not and cannot have direct knowledge of the mind of Ilúvatar. Now, the information we find in the published Akallabêth, which recounts the words and deeds of Ar-Pharazôn in Valinor, and explains the Valar's motivations in yielding up the government of Arda, these must necessarily derive either from Elvish sources in Tol Eressëa, or, if they do originate with Elendil, from surmise. Because once he's in Middle-earth, Elendil simply cannot have absolute certainty about why the downfall happened. Instead, he is left with the inescapable and shattering fact that it did happen. I read the Akallabêth as Elendil coming to terms with the enormity of that fact. The loss of the land he loved and the deaths of untold numbers of his countrymen, including, lest we forget, the children and non-human inhabitants of Númenor, all of whom have now paid the price for the sins of others. Now, a theodicy of divine punishment for apostasy is perfectly comprehensible given the rather cataclysmic circumstances, but it generates the same problems as the blessings and curses of Jeremiah. Is a God who actively wills the slaughter of innocents a God worth believing in? This is not idle speculation about the motivations of a fictional character, by the way. Tolkien's entire mythopoetic project can be understood as theodicy, as a response to the collapse of meaning in the face of untold sufferings during the 20th century. One need only look to the First World War in which Tolkien himself served. Something has gone crack, he wrote, upon the death of his friend Rob Gilson at the Somme in 1916. And in a single sentence, he captures the feeling that pervaded his generation, in some ways all generations that have come after them. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor points to World War I as the critical inflection point in the decline of religious belief in the modern West. The industrial progress, note the scare quotes, of the Western colonial powers in modernity had not produced a secular utopia, still less the heavenly city on earth. Its chief outcome was rather the disenchantment of the world, the immiseration of the masses, and a military conflagration of unprecedented proportions whose perfunctory conclusion merely set the stage for 2 more decades of economic collapse and another even bloodier war, this one with atomic weapons. Taylor asks how to respond to this sense, the idea that we are living after the demise of a viable order. A God who could stand aside in the face of such senseless violence was and is simply no longer credible to many people, perhaps especially those like Tolkien who served on the front lines and witnessed the pointless slaughter of their friends and countrymen. Now, Tolkien, as we well know, did not abandon his own Roman Catholicism, but given his identification with the dreamer protagonists of The Lost Road and the Notion Club papers, and given the identification of those figures with Elendil, it seems reasonable to me to suggest that Elendil is a figure with whom Tolkien felt a special kinship. Like him and like the prophet Jeremiah, Tolkien was a devout believer who was forced by unendurable circumstances to square his belief in a good and just God with an evil and unjust world. The exercise of parsing Elendil's Akallabêth note, as a text produced by an historically situated individual with his own theological leanings and theological longings, can help us to read Tolkien's Akallabêth as the same thing, contributing to a more textured understanding of how Tolkien's art responds to those selfsame questions of meaning. Now, in the next stage of my research, I intend to engage alternative streams in progressive Christian and Jewish thought with a multivocality of Tolkien's own corpus, to read between the lines and in other sections of the legendarium in order to posit a counter-theodicy to the Akallabêth's metaphysics of blessings and curses. This is, in short, not the only theological game in Arda. But for now, I wish to simply pan the proverbial camera outward to the wider cultural and religious context in which this seminar is taking place. In the first place, 2021 marked the first time in history that fewer than 50% of Americans, my home country, claimed membership in a religious community. Second, as of writing, Amazon Prime's The Rings of Power is well underway adapting the second age for the silver screen. I am curious to see how the show intends to portray the downfall of Númenor, with its central motif of a god who condemns an entire continent to controlled demolition, in the form of a television program aimed at an increasingly non-religious 21st century audience. My point is that this points to the continued relevance of the questions Tolkien was asking, and it challenges us as readers and as scholars to grapple responsibly with the answers he offers, and pose some questions of our own in turn. Thank you.
Phenomenal. Need to think of like new words. Okay, Tom, you're with now online. Thank you very, very much for sharing that information with us and for recording your video. As well, I've been repeatedly saying it throughout today, but I'm just consistently impressed with how many different ways we can read the same material and just continue to find new fascinating ways without it becoming boring. So thank you very much for sharing your own reading with us. I've just repeated myself there, sorry. Okay, let's jump into a Q&A. So have we got any questions from anyone in the room? Yes.
Hi, Tom, this is Cami Egan. I just wanted to add to your sort of midway through your paper, you talked about the invisibility of Eru and the Valar versus the visibility of death. And I wanted to add, because I'm working with this problem as well, also the visibility of Morgoth, the visibility of Morgoth Melkor and what he has done, and the visibility of Sauron. So they can't see the good beings, but they can see the evil beings and they can see the results of the evil beings. So is that going to be part of your development of this counter-theodicy? Is that a big problem?
Thanks. Yeah, can everybody hear me in the room and online? Yes. Great. So I think you're really right in pointing out that one of the great problems or opportunities, whatever you want to call it, of religious belief is that the object of devotion is typically not visible, at least in the Christian and Jewish and Abrahamic tradition, but the ill effects of the world around us are. And I think that one of my ongoing thoughts about Tolkien as a writer and as a theologian is that he's really writing less to a pre-Christian past than to a post-Christian present and future, in which God is not someone who intervenes in history or is visible in the way that God seems to be in the narratives of the Bible, but rather is one who must be discerned in the secret workings of the world. And so the answer is yes, and I appreciate your drawing attention to those particular figures as ways to think about the visualization and tangibility of evil.
Wonderful. Hello, that is come through, isn't it? Yep, it is. Okay, I was just speaking quietly for once. Okay, so new question online this time. So, hello, Reverend Tom. A question. What do you think of Queen Tarmiriel and that last image of her climbing the Meneltama as the Great Wave approaches? What do you think was her purpose in doing so? Was her faith betrayed?
That's, I think the image in its power invites multiple readings. I don't think, obviously we're not inside her head. We're not privy to her thoughts at that moment or her motivations. It is very likely, to me at least, that like most people in situations of extreme catastrophe, that her motivations are multiple. The simple desire to preserve her body, to preserve her life, the overmastering fear of what is coming. And also, I mean, I think your idea of is her faith being betrayed, that is, if we believe in the goodness of God, right, and bad things still happen, if evil still occurs, if suffering still takes place, I think this, her experience of the downfall, literally the end of her world, that is, it has the form, it has the flavor, it has the emotional tenor of the experience of those who have not been taken down in a literal downfall, but have nevertheless lived through similar kinds of personal or ecological or social catastrophe. So my answer is, I think there could be a lot of things going on, but the image is powerful.
Yeah, and I suppose, like, as you've just said, that idea we're not in her head is quite an important point to reiterate. So yeah, thank you. Jumping back into the room. Any more questions? Yeah, straight up.
Hi, thank you for a great paper. You asked at the end how, but that was true for the series, The Rings of Power, but I was wondering, Tolkien, and it has been said several times in the papers today, there was no reference, or he cut out reference to religion. So is it not possible for atheist people not to believe that God actually, or any divinity punishes the Númenóreans, but simply reason? After a while, when you get completely irreasonable, something is going to give up. So is it possible that by eliminating all kinds of proselytism, he spoke also to atheist people by just saying, whatever you believe in, if you go that way, it's not going to go well?
I think that one of the brilliant effects, and Catherine Madsen and Verlin Flieger have both written about this ably, of Tolkien deliberately leaving out or taking out religious reference, is that it opens up the space for reader interpretation, not just on a what is that character thinking, what is, not just on that level, but on the level of theology. These stories are presented as the works of particular authors with particular viewpoints. And I think that there is absolutely room in a reading of the Akallabêth and of the Downfall of Númenor for other perspectives. We have some idea of what Tolkien's own authorial perspective is, but the way in which he constructs the text and the particular literary devices he uses, notably drawing, leaving out or scrubbing out those religious references, I think leaves a wider palette of options open than perhaps he even would have been comfortable with the interpretation of his work. But if he didn't like that, he ought not have written it that way.